Hello, and welcome to the Nintendo Power Retrospectives. I'm Count Zero. This time we have Nintendo Power issue 31 for December of 1991, bringing an end to the magazine's third year, sorry. Oh, how the years blur together. And this issue also has our first Game Boy cover game in the magazine thus far. Let's get started. Our cover game, as mentioned, is our first Game Boy game to make the cover, with Metroid 2, The Return of Samus. Although the cover features graphical assets from the NES version in the background. Also, Samus has a very physically awkward pose. She's not wearing the boob armor from the poster from earlier, but still, it looks like she's moving to jump or something, but ended up turning her body towards the camera mid-jump. It's one of the more physically uncomfortable action poses I've seen, and I've seen a few. In the letters column, we get readers writing in with what they want in their ultimate game system, which basically involves people throwing numbers around without knowing what they mean, and wanting consoles that are basically robots that also run video games. There's a far more interesting side of the page opposite this, which has a whole bunch of creative gaming-related things people have done, including a Tetris patchwork quilt and a very nicely done Mario snowman, complete with a sculpted mustache. We also have a selection of envelope art, though we don't get a great look at it. The games shown this issue are Star Tropics, Dr. Mario, and Battletoads. You know, envelope art is one of the things I really like about video game magazines, and I'm surprised we don't get more fandom-related magazines like Otaku USA, for example, running envelope art. Maybe they're not getting enough, I don't know. Moving into the game coverage, we start off with the NES title Batman: Return of the Joker from Sunsoft. The game is, narratively, a follow-up to the Batman movie licensed game, but with visuals which take more of a cue from the comics, and which assume that the Joker survived the ending instead of being killed. Aside from being an action platformer like the last game, this title also has a few auto-scrolling shooting stages as well. This game is not fun. The first Batman game had very precise, carefully tuned platforming like you got in the Ninja Gaiden games, or to a certain degree the Mega Man games, combined with the urban gothic aesthetics of Tim Burton's movie. This game loses all of that. This is a run-and-gun game that feels almost like it was a reskin of some other title, were it not for the fact that the game's overall aesthetics fit that of the Batman comics. Considering how much I enjoyed the first Batman game, the step down here is a considerable disappointment. Next up is Nestor's Adventures. The tip this time is for Kid Icarus for the Game Boy, with the advice being to move to the left and shoot straight up while dealing with the tumbling mirrors. Except, if memory serves, in the Kid Icarus games you can only shoot in the direction you're facing, which makes this tip not only useless, but useless and non-factual. In the classified information column, we have a tip for Super Mario World that lets you get 8 extra lives through an invulnerability extension on Donut Secret 2. Moving on to one of the SNES titles of this issue with Actraiser. Now this is a launch game I haven't played before. The game... Next we move on to another of the SNES launch titles with Actraiser. Now this is a game I haven't played before. We get maps of the action levels in the realms of Fillmore, Bloodpool, Cassandra, and Itos. There isn't really any coverage of the God Game aspects of the gameplay, though. Actraiser's mix of God Game and action platformer is interesting. The platforming elements are nicely done, with great music and creative level design. And then there's the God Game portion of the title. I get what they're trying to do. They're trying to give God game elements where you're generally hands-off. You just tell people where to go, and they do things on their own, and it's generally kind of vague about how things are done. It's hands-off. However, it feels tedious here, particularly with having to slowly direct your worshippers over to the monster lairs one square at a time. Yes, you can just go shoot all the monsters yourself, but that's also fairly tedious because some of these lairs have hundreds of monsters. So it's faster to have the worshippers go there, but it'd probably be even faster to give the player the option just to go down and have an action stage where they go through the monster lair and kill them and take out a boss monster themselves. It's just lots of busy work telling characters which tiles to build on instead of just being able to give them the order to, okay, build to the monster lair and have them just do it. Sitting down and playing a bunch of Actraiser, I now understand why the god sequences were dropped from Actraiser 2. I'd rather they were tweaked to make them less tedious, but if they couldn't manage to improve on them, I also understand why they were cut. In Counselor's Corner, we have a mix of tips from older NES games and new SNES titles. Of note, there's a secret exit from Cheese Bridge in Super Mario World, and we get instructions on how to find it. We also get a tip for Star Tropics with the frequency you need to use to contact Dr. J in Chapter 4. Now, that information is on the letter that you got with the game if you bought it new. However, if you lost the letter, or rented the game, or picked up a copy used, that information is definitely helpful. Absolutely necessary to proceed in the game. We return to the NES with Ocean's Addams Family. We have maps of some of the early levels of the game, in addition to what sub-levels or levels are where in the hub area. As with the last Ocean game I reviewed, Darkman, this feels a lot like a PC platformer, a bad PC platformer, ported to the NES. Here's the thing. When I look at a lot of PC platformers that get slack cut for them, particularly titles for Ocean, I feel like they get that room for error because at the time, during the 80s and the 90s, a lot of PC platformers didn't have the same graphical depth to them as they did in other genres like simulators and RPGs. Not to saying there aren't good PC platformers. The Commander Keen games are excellent. It's just that PC platformers, particularly ones from, honestly, British companies, particularly ones designed for the Specky, are iffy. The platforming is floaty and imprecise, it's hard to handle, and awkward to control. I mean, it's better than an isometric platformer, but by saying that, I am damning the game with faint praise. If you combine these big, floaty, imprecise jumps with some incredibly cheap hits, and you have a platform that is absolute rubbish. And by cheap hits, I mean literally unavoidable hits. And you have a platformer that is absolute rubbish, and I recommend avoiding at all costs. Next up is a Konami licensed platformer with Tiny Toon Adventures for the NES. With the maps on the poster and the maps in the article itself, we have coverage of pretty much the whole game. Last issue, I talked about the Flintstones platformer and the importance of deciding whether your licensed platformer's physics are going to emulate the genre of the work you're adapting and designing your levels accordingly, or whether you're going to design the level first, use aesthetics from the work in question, and then use physics that work with whatever your design is. Tiny Toon Adventures is a great example of a game which goes with the genre emulation physics route and does it right. The game has a fair amount of inertia in its movement animation. It doesn't necessarily have an uncontrolled slide or skid, but it does have some continued movement when you release the button of several character widths. The game's levels are designed with that in mind, so the player isn't expected to do super precise jumps. Additionally, the player is able to select a backup character in the form of Plucky Duck, Furball, or Dizzy Devil, and switch between them when they collect certain items. Each backup character controls a little differently. Plucky can glide if you hold down the jump button. Dizzy has a spin attack, which lets you attack while running as opposed to having to jump on enemies. and while I didn't play as Furball, quick research shows he's able to climb walls, giving him another alternate traversal ability. The game's levels are very well designed, the game controls very well. The game's main problem is the checkpointing, or rather, the lack thereof. You die, you go back to the beginning of the level. By contrast, in the Mario games, there are mid-level checkpoints that you hit if you get far enough, and if you die, you restart there. Further, the game gives you super mushrooms often enough that you can recover from a cheap hit without too much effort. Here, extra hit items, hearts, are rare enough that a single hit can force you to restart the level, which can actually make it a little more difficult to learn from your mistakes. As a game, it's alright. I certainly enjoyed it. I may even pick up a copy at some point in the future, but it can definitely do with some gameplay tweaks.